Hello folks, and welcome to my Rustic Tiny, where I'm building the DIY tiny house of my dreams as a complete beginner. In this video, I'm going to be showing how I built the structural ridge for the roof, why I decided to go with a gable roof rather than a shed-style roof or a monoslope roof, and talk about the planning that went into designing the vertical supports and where they went in the build. I want to remind you that I am a complete beginner, so this video is for entertainment purposes only. I don't suggest that you follow my design in any way unless you are consulting with an engineer or an architect in your own build. There's just something about shed-style roofs that I didn't quite like. I don't like the asymmetry of them, and I knew that I wanted as much headspace in the usable area of each loft as I could get, and I knew that a gable roof would give me the highest amount of headspace right in the center instead of way at one end or the other end. But I also know that, I learned this in roofing class at Hammerstone, that a gable roof is that much more complicated to design and build than a shed-style roof. There's a couple different ways you can go about it, and one of them is a structural ridge. And with a structural ridge, I would need supports. I would need vertical posts to hold them up. And so that's one thing that I almost thought I couldn't do because of the cantilevers. Now in my head, initially when I learned about the vertical posts, I thought they had to be at each far end of the house. But if I have a cantilever, it goes at an angle and there's no straight up and down right at the end. So I couldn't have a vertical post right at the end. So I ended up bringing it in and having the posts be a couple feet in from each end, wherever the smartest location was, depending on the room layout or where they fell on the trailer crossbeams. This is one of the very first things I drew out for my tiny house plans, and it is a scale drawing of the tiny house trailer itself. And so I had actually gone out there, even when it was still covered by a tarp, and I peeled back as much as I could peel back, and I measured out where each of these 2-inch cross members, steel cross members were. And I knew that wherever my vertical posts would be supporting the ridge beam of the roof, they needed to fall on these cross members in order to be the most fully supported. And so this was the bow end. I needed 3 cross members in, or 4 cross members in from the edge. And then at this end, at the stern end, I could give myself a little bit more space, because this area would also be on the second floor where the sleeping loft is. I couldn't have a vertical post sticking right through the middle of the sleeping loft so that there wouldn't be enough room for a bed to be up there. So this one I moved in further. And over here at the bow end, this is going to be where the bathroom was anyways. I couldn't have it be in the middle of the kitchen, which would start over here. Can't just have a vertical post in the middle of the kitchen. So I had to line it up with the closest cross member to the dividing line between the bathroom and the kitchen. And so this was the best placement for that vertical post. This vertical post over here is pretty much at the dividing line between the sleeping loft, where that ends, and where I'll have a staircase to go down, and also where the living room is. So there'd be a seating area right here, a couch facing the giant picture window, but I also needed room for the stairs, the pull-out stairs to go. And I knew I couldn't have the post getting in the way of that. So I had to plan this part out pretty carefully, exactly where to put those 2 posts. So I just finished assembling these posts that will support the majority of the weight of the ridge beam. And in the center, the ridge beam is going to be 2 layers of 2x8s and then a 1/2-inch layer of plywood inside, and being held in place by these outer arms. So these are ready to be installed on the floor, but it's been raining on and off throughout the day, and this still has to dry more from pulling off the tarps this morning. It was pretty wet underneath all of the tarps. So I just want it to dry more fully. I have to wait until it dries more so I can even get some pencil marks on this subfloor to mark out where that post goes. So we just finished setting up these 2 vertical posts one at the bow end has brackets up top. I planned it out so that it can line up with that joist. And it's got brackets down below. Then down here at the stern end, we have the same thing, except it bolts to this end joist, and there's brackets down below. We also glued these posts to the subfloor with construction adhesive at the time of installation. So this is the other rafter tie / ridge beam holder that I made to go in between the two posts. So it's going to sit on top of the top plate and just kind of be an extra support as we're adding the ridge beam. For added support, I might take off these brackets afterwards, after the beam is installed, and put in longer posts on the sides to match the other two vertical posts, or I might just keep it like this. I haven't quite decided yet. So we're working on the ridge beam today, and it's the top and bottom layer of 2x8 and a 1/2 inch layer of plywood, glued between every layer and nailed about every 2 feet. Here's the nails. 3 nails about every 2 feet. And I'm making it in 2 different sections to make it a bit easier. I mean, it's still going to be heavy, but a lot easier to handle. So this is how this end will look. Each of the layers will stagger with the other layers. And now I'll work on the other half. Here's the middle support, that vertical post, and a temporary holder for that end. The post and temporary holder at that end. They'll splice together somewhere over top of this at 3 different points. So we'll do that once we get both pieces up there. I'll add glue, clamp them together, and then add fasteners. So this is my brother-in-law and his 2 sons helping to lift the ridge beam that day. They started with the shorter half of the ridge beam, clamped it in place at the vertical supports, and then lifted up the longer half. They put that right through the wall cavities, and then from the inside, they lifted it up incrementally, one side at a time, until it was fully in place. The entire ridge beam ended up being just over 37 feet long when it was fully assembled. Here the construction adhesive is being added to the different staggered layers of the ridge beam, and I was waiting eagerly below to see if my measurements were correct, and boom, it lined up so perfectly. I was entirely satisfied with watching that process. Here's that center support. I added arms to either side and put that L bracket back on, and then it's supported down at that end and has a temporary end piece, and it's repeated down at this other end behind me. It was a little after 8 a.m. on Sunday, the day after we installed this ridge beam, and so today I will be cutting all the rafters for it. Hopefully I'll be able to cut all of them. There's 58 rafters that'll need to be cut for this, and hoping for a smooth process. So the chop saw I was using for all of the framing, the trigger mechanism, something inside it broke last night as I was cutting the blocking for the rafters. So this is the backup saw that my dad had in the barn. Blew off all the cobwebs and dirt and stuff. And this one I can set to angles, so I'm going to see how accurate this 14-degree cut is, because that's the angle I need for a 312 pitch roof. Well, it's almost 7:30 p.m. after a pretty tiring day of rafter cutting. We managed to get 22 up, and also discovered at the start of the process that the ridge beam isn't completely centered. So the rafters on the starboard side are a bit longer than the rafters on the port side, And so we've had to custom measure and cut every rafter individually in order to get them to fit, which has made for a very tedious and slow process. I also don't know what that means for what the sheathing will be like or what the metal roofing panels will be like if the roofing is not completely symmetrical on each side of the ridge beam. But I guess we will find out when we get to that point. It's almost 7:30 p.m. on September 1st, and we just finished installing the final rafter. All 58 of them are in. Tomorrow we'll start installing the roof sheathing. It's looking pretty amazing so far, and I'm looking forward to having it protected from the rain, at least on top. It's supposed to rain on Thursday, so some will still get in through the walls, but hopefully we'll be able to finish the sheathing all in one day. Bright and early on Wednesday morning. Yesterday we were able to put on the whole center section of zip roof panels, but we didn't have a chance to get to the outsides yet, so we'll be using today to finish all of that. I got the seams taped up on the parts that we did get, and I'll finish taping around all of the edges of the overhangs. Also wrap some zip tape around those. Today should be an easier day than it was yesterday climbing up there. So it's Saturday morning. We finished adding the roof sheathing on Wednesday evening around 6:30. And it's been raining on and off today. It'll rain throughout the majority of the day. We've got a little bit of drops coming in here, but for the most part, it's pretty darn dry inside, which is awesome considering I still don't have walls for most of the area. Now that this tiny house is closer to being fully closed in, you can see more close up these various supports for the structural ridge down there, and that centerpiece. It is a different design than these two posts. You can also see some of this 14.5-inch 2x4 blocking that I added during the process of adding in the rafters, which kind of turned out to be problematic in the spacing. I kind of wish I hadn't used for the build. I could have done other things to make the spacing more consistent, but at this point, now that it's all said and done and the sheathing is on, I do think that it should at least add to some of the rigidity of the roof and the ridge. I also want to point out that where I spliced various 2x8s together on the ridge beam, I added these very beefy GRK fasteners. And up here on the vertical supports, I added these even beefier 5-inch timber screws to alternating sides. And so with one coming in from each end, they very firmly sandwiched that ridge beam in between them. So now that I've talked a bit more about how I designed and built the ridge beam and these various supports that hold it up, I want to talk about the roof pitch and why I chose 312. Now, I knew from the beginning that I wanted a metal roof, but looking more into it, I discovered that the typical corrugated metal roof panels that have the exposed fasteners, even though the metal itself might have an 80 to 100-year lifespan, those metal fasteners with the little gaskets on them might only last 8 to 12 years, and a lot of times they're installed incorrectly. And I've seen images of the screws over time coming unscrewed from the surface and lifting up and ruining the entire roof. And so, doing more research into metal roof options, I discovered standing seam. And for a standing seam, there are no exposed fasteners, but the minimum, I'm not sure about for the regular type of corrugated roof panels, but the minimum pitch for a standing seam is 312. And that's what I went with this. I knew that if I had any steeper of a roof pitch, then that would significantly lessen the amount of headspace I had in the loft at each end. And so 312 was the minimum. That's what I went with. It required a 14-degree angle for the rafters, and that was my starting point for designing out the rafters on the graph paper, even though things kind of got a little bit messy in the actual building of things because of the ridge beam not being fully centered, and deciding that I would cut the rafters even with the walls for this specific house design. So there was a lot of things that went into this gable roof, but I really like the symmetry of it. I really like how much headspace I have, both in the center of each loft and at each end, even though I have bumped my head a decent number of times in this lower second loft compared to the sleeping loft, which has a higher headroom. But yeah, I think if I did it again, I'd maybe do some things differently, such as not include the blocking here. Just use a tape measure to go along, as I did with the bottom plates when framing out the walls. Use a tape measure to measure out 16-inch on center instead of using that blocking. And be more careful to make sure that the ridge beam was fully centered and those vertical supports were fully centered when they got installed. Those are really the only things I would change at this point if I had to build this roof again. So thanks to everybody who's been following along on this DIY tiny house journey with me. I've been enjoying the process of building very much and putting these videos together of my process, and I look forward to all of the different steps that are coming up and being able to learn more as I go and educate myself on the different systems that go on inside the house after it's been dried in. So be sure to like and subscribe and comment and follow along with me on the rest of this DIY tiny house building journey.